Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is my great pleasure to bring back Bill Firestone, who's a longtime institution here, faculty member. And he's going to describe some work that he's been doing with Robin McCown, who's graduate student here, as well as Andrew Leland, who's a recent graduate here, as well as some other colleagues. And we're really thrilled. This work grew out of work that's, well, Bill described, but out of work around reforming the EDD as a program, and it's had a major effect on what we do in our program. So let's go.
Great. Thank you, Drew, and thank you. I want to acknowledge Robin, who's been working on this right from the beginning, and who's going to answer all the questions at the end. She now knows. I guess I need the clicker because
no, you're fine.
There's so many things to tap. If I tap that one, it's nothing. Okay. The other thing I have to say is, for those of you in the PhD program, this is a lesson in what happens if you're a professor for too long. You retire and you don't quit. So my last year at GSE, I wrote a research grant proposal and got funded. And we won't go into how sick that is, but I got the funding and I'm still doing the work even though I'm retired. The work grew out of the EDD program. So I'm starting off with a picture of me teaching EDD students in the summer of not too long ago. Kath remembers some of these students, I'm sure, and maybe some of the others of you do too. So I was involved in when we revised our EDD program. And at the same time, I have, over the years, been doing a lot of work on how different kinds of ideas, including research ideas, get into schools. So I got this idea, and I guess I was really thinking about it as an applied issue with the EDD program, but I also got the idea as a research issue that we ought to understand more how EDD programs help their graduates learn to use research in their work after they grow up, or what can I say, grow up, after they graduate. So just a little background, there are two streams of, can I get this thing at the top to go away? More technology than I understand.
Sorry.
There we go.
Look at that little thing, but that's
okay. So there are two streams of policy/research that have historically, sometimes for a long time, sometimes for not so long, been about creating a push to use evidence in schools. One is a body of work on research use, which comes out of fields like public health. There is some work in education. There is work in policy analysis more generally. And one of the implications, one of the phenomena related to that has been this push to use validated research, often meaning randomized trials, to improve practice. And there have been, oh gosh, since the 60s, a whole variety of programs in the federal government to get research used in practice. The regional labs, which are still around, a whole variety of demonstration programs where people that my colleagues would call linking agents would go out and say, here's some research you should know about, all kinds of efforts to develop and validate math programs and get those put out there. The What Works Clearinghouse, et cetera. And the studies on this process have shown that the uptake of research is not as rational and as successful as has been assumed, but where it does work, there's also often a critical role of brokers, somebody coming between the researchers or program developers and the people in the schools. Another body of work that I learned, a little bit to my chagrin when I started going out to other EDD programs, has to do with data use, some of which I knew about anyway. it's become more popular because of accountability policies. So when we talk about data use, we're talking about any use of testing, demographic, student work, or other kinds of data to analyze and guide practice in schools. And probably the most developed version of this is data-driven decision-making, which focuses on how teachers use data. But there are other aspects of it too. And here, the external push comes through trainers and developers and people like that who bring ideas to schools. So that's kind of been the external push. And I think what we decided was, if you look at some more, where do I point this thing at? Oh, there we go. Okay, so both of these streams are external to schools. Both of them rely on brokers in the roles of linking agents or trainers to get evidence used in schools. And both streams of research have identified the critical role of leaders, who are key boundary spanners and the people who kind of decide what research or evidence comes into schools, gets used in schools, and is critical for how other people are going to feel about it in schools. There's also evidence and anecdotes about their limited capacity to understand and address evidence issues. So that has some implications, we thought, for the EDD program. One is that EDD programs shouldn't substitute for these brokerage programs, but could complement them by preparing leaders to better understand, use, and support various kinds of evidence use. Another is that, and kind of related, is that the EDD is well positioned to provide that kind of preparation because it's on the boundary between the academy and the field. It's recently, since the mid-2000s, been repositioned to be more practice-oriented. And it's still deeply tied to PhD norms about teaching research. So there's a lot of research coming into EDD programs. Now, when I say better use, that means both more critical use as well as more use. Important caveat there. So the original questions that we put into the proposal to the funding agency, and my experience has always been that the questions change. But for me, they were, how do a sample of EDD programs teach students to use research evidence? That is, what are the program practices and what are the program understandings of those practices and what they're about? And second, how do alumni report using research evidence? And to our knowledge, nobody has looked at either of these, in particular, what's going on with alumni. But I'm not going to talk about the alumni today. So the revised first question, which is what we're going to focus on today, is what capacities do EDD programs work to provide to their graduates? And I'm a little behind myself there. And I'm going to start with the conclusion so you know where I'm going, and then we can go from there. So the conclusions are that there are 3 capacity areas that are being worked on or should be worked on. The first has to do with research skills. And in this area, they have been revised from what you see in the PhD program to make them more concrete, practical, and relevant to leaders. The second, which I wanted to pick out as something separate, has to do with problem finding skills, which again have been revised. The emphasis on problem finding skills is less, let's find a problem that advances theory than a problem that emphasizes some sort of addressing some sort of practical issue in the life of the students themselves. And the third is use skills. And this is one that we think has gotten less attention. It merges into the issue of leadership, and we're going to argue that it's relatively underdeveloped in the curriculum. And this was sort of an issue that kind of popped out as we were looking at things in the schools. So it's a little hard to document an absence, but that was something that struck us as we moved through this. So, methods. What our study is a case study project of 4 exemplary programs that I've been working with the CPED, the Carnegie Project on the Education Doctorate. The 4th member of our group, Jill Perry, is the head of CPED. And we relied a lot on her to identify what were a set of good programs. The one piece of evidence we had was that 3 of them had students win the Dissertation in Practice of the Year award. One of the things we got into when we were negotiating to get the final round of money was dissertation design. We wound up with 2 programs that had individual dissertations like at Rutgers, and then 2 others that had group dissertations. The programs are distributed coast to coast, all over the place. We have 3 major research universities, so one of my colleagues who I've roped into working with us on all of this is keep pointing out, you've got a fairly elite set of programs here. So this really is more exemplary than, a kind of random distribution. What we've done is we've made site visits to these 4 places where we interviewed faculty, we interviewed students, we collected all kinds of documents, syllabi, readings, course schedules, got some dissertations, and we're finding we can get a lot more. And we sat in on classes. What we didn't get probably enough of is observation of dissertation advising. But one of the programs that did group dissertation advising had all the student groups come in one day we were there, and that was really pretty interesting. We have also collected surveys and interviews with alumni, which are burning a hole in my computer and waiting for Robin and I and others to get around to analyzing this, but not yet. So again, we found 3 capacity areas. And I'm going to talk about each of them. This is going to go really fast, and then we can handle questions. The first has to do with research skills. And a lot of this is like what you see in a PhD program. Except I want to emphasize some things that I never thought of as things that needed to be taught, but that are focused, rather explicit foci in some of these programs, because it turns out that people who spend all of their lives being principals and superintendents, and by the way, we have a lot of, as at Rutgers, we have a lot of university level administrators in some of these programs. Things like, where do you go to find research? And how do you assess research? And where do you go and how do you understand? Well, the understanding, I think, and assessing is something that more or less implicitly goes on all the time, but the issue of finding it turns out to be something they appreciate a lot. And I will just say, for anybody who has any influence on the EDD program here, one of the things that the students said at the end is, we're really good at finding stuff now, and we're really good at using the library, and we graduate and we lose our library privileges, so we don't know how to find this stuff anymore. So it was interesting that some of these programs had, one of the ways they kind of kept a connection with their alumni was by finding a way for them to have that connection to the library, and some didn't, and their students were telling them about it. So just throwing that out there. So they did this largely through the kinds of things you would see in a lot of doctoral programs. So there were a lot of lit review tasks. There were a lot of dissecting articles in class, with a teacher or with the instructor as a kind of coach, asking questions and raising issues. There was a lot about the learning of different kinds of methods and the theory behind the methods, and a lot of hands-on data collection and analysis tasks. What was different was that they were typically more closely linked to the problem of practice. So in one program, the methods courses were actually starting in the 2nd year, were beginning to be kind of coaching courses on how to do the dissertation. It was all integrated into one package. In another program, well, there were also other programs that allowed students to talk about their dissertations. This was particularly in the individual dissertations. When they had group dissertations, a lot of the methods instruction was integrated into what seemed like substantive courses, but the methods and the substance were kind of linked together to practical problems. The hands-on projects would turn out to be things that were more connected to what's going on in schools or the university or somehow related to your work. Sometimes it was data collected by students, and one program had a course on personnel where the gist of the course was districts would bring in personnel data and say, we need this analyzed. And the students would take the data set and they'd work on it for a good chunk of the summer and ask some questions. And I guess the faculty, I didn't get all the details of this, but I guess the faculty, not the faculty, but the district people would say, here's some issues we have, can you sort this out? And they'd work on it and work through the data and come back and do a report at the end. So they were doing data analysis tasks, but they were doing it with a plan. And the other thing is, as they were learning about methods, there was constant reference back to the practice problems that they were working on. And I guess another thing I should add is in the group dissertations, one of the things the faculty really liked were the students would say, you know, to do this project, we need to learn a different method. And they'd find a method and they say, okay, here's the method we want to use. And they wind up selling it to the faculty and they teach themselves. So the practice and the method stuff were more tightly linked than they might be in other kinds of programs. So the other issue that I want to highlight is problem finding skills. And here the issue is finding practical but researchable problems. And the focus, strangely enough, is on the dissertation problem. We'll see it's not the only place where it happens, but a lot of it happens around the dissertation problem. And I thought when I got into this was that, well, of course, you know, it's a challenge students have to get through. You have to help students get through it in a way that kind of makes a connection to them so that they feel motivated about it all. But what we started talking to people and we learned about this was that an appropriately framed problem can set the stage for later use. And it kind of jumps ahead to some of the use issues that I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes. So one of the faculty members that we were talking to was talking about in their program, when they were admitting students, the essay that the students would write was define the problem of practice you want to do for your dissertation. So they were getting them into the problem of practice right from the beginning. And they would accept students based on what they said about their problem of practice, knowing, as this faculty member says, when you, the student, come in, the only thing that you're sure of is that you have a problem. You don't know if anybody else in your workplace thinks that's a problem. If you ask parents or your kids in your school, would they think this is a problem or are they happy with it? If you ask your colleagues down the hall, do they think it's a problem? And other people in that program were saying the same kind of thing. People kind of have an idea in their head that there's a problem, but they may not know how it's connected to anything else. And the idea we got in thinking about this is that if you frame the problem appropriately up front with input from other people, you set the stage for the report, if there's a report at the end. You generate an interest in whatever you're going to find. So part of the use step actually starts with this problem finding process. And they at least get some inkling of that when they go through a problem finding process with this kind of coaching along the way. So where students find and learn about their problems, again, it's in the context of finding their dissertation problems. And some of it is in recon of the problem context. This one program I was just talking about, they have their students spend a lot of time going back to the location where they're going to do the dissertation of practice and learn about what's going on there beyond what they think they know from having worked there already, and make sure they really understand what the problem is. A couple of programs talked about solutionitis, because if you're doing a problem of practice, you tend to know what the problem is, and you tend to say, well, for my dissertation, I want to fix it by doing this. And one of the points of the recon stage is to get people past that and to think a little more broadly about what solutions might be available and they might have thought about initially. Another thing that is important for finding dissertation problems is the literature. And, you know, I mean, I've always been a good professor. I've always told all my students, well, you should go to the literature and see what it has to say about this. And I didn't think about it too much until I was talking to a faculty member in one of the programs, and he said, well, you get a lot of questions about what's the right theory. And so I talked to them a lot about evaluating what you have found people have said about the theory. Does it feel like it's concrete based on what you've learned about how you evaluate the research literature? How does the theory fit for you, meaning fit with the situation? Does it feel like it helps you explain the situation? Does it feel like it helps you ask research questions that feel true to what you think about in that context? So on the one hand, it's looking at the fit between, you know, it starts from the assumption that there's several theories you might choose from, and then you go back to the situation and what fits best. And the point is, it's a subjective judgment, I think. This kind of fits under the heading of what the research use people call conceptual use of research. And I thought it finally brought a lot of stuff together for me about why we use research in dissertations, particularly if you're doing practical problems. And then there's a social process in the group dissertations, which I found fascinating. I've had some debates with people, not real debates, because I didn't have that big a stake in it, about the individual dissertation and group dissertations. And what seems to happen in the group dissertation is you're going to wind up with 3 to 5 people who join the group with an idea of what they want to study for their dissertation. And you put aside what the situation is going to be for a minute. What they have to do is come to consensus about what would be a useful problem to study. And that negotiation problem and formulating a problem out of, you know, these diverse interests was explained to me by a couple of district assistant superintendents and people like that. This is very like the process you go through in a central office, figuring out what you do next. So it seemed to have a lot of real life implications for figuring out what are appropriate problems to look at, and what you're going to go through in the future as you start. If you're going to be doing things like this in the future as part of your work, the kind of process you're going through, again, it's this kind of aspect of getting to use already. So a lot of the work had to do with dissertations, but there were other things going on as well. Sometimes courses have mini cases or projects that students had to do where they learned about finding a problem. One program had a year-long course where each student, this was a program with a group dissertation. But before that, each student would come in with a problem from her or his place of work, and spend a year figuring out what's the problem, collecting data about it, analyzing it, and coming up with some suggestions that they could take back to where they were working. So they would go through this process on their own before they would do it with a group. Again, this personnel course where they were given a data set and had to figure out, and a problem probably from the people at the district, and had to figure out what to do with it. Another thing that showed up in 2 programs, which I think would be really relevant to the GSE, given the interest in equity right now, is something called equity audits, where the idea of an equity audit is people in a district, or in this case, the students, would collect a lot of relatively hard data about distributions of something and what's behind it. It would kind of go beyond well, there's a difference between free lunch kids and non-free lunch kids and their achievement to use related data to understand why and figure out what to do with it. So there were courses that had students do these kind of equity audits and then share them with the people in the districts that did these things. And it was particularly interesting when one of those people was the superintendent of the district in question, but it was probably more interesting when the person wasn't in power and had to figure out what to do with the equity audit after they'd done it. But again, this is an issue of finding problems that are quite practical, and in this case, probably fairly political. So that's problem finding. And then there's the issue of use skills. And we kind of divided use skills into two parts. One has to do with advocacy, and this fits with the part of the research use literature that talks about tactical use of research. There are typologies of the way research is used: instrumental, conceptual, which I've talked about, and tactical, which is when you're trying to persuade somebody of something. Robin knows a lot about this from her school board work, where you get people coming in saying, research says da 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 da, and it may or may not be there. Or you come in and you need to persuade a school board member of something or other. And you want to use research as part of the evidence, and people say, well, okay, I've got to just digress to the best bit of coaching I got when I was doing policy work in New Jersey. And they took us down to the legislature, and they said, you're coming down there with all your research, and you're trying to persuade the legislature. And the aide said, but remember, you're competing with Vinnie the Barber. And you've got to convince somebody who knows Vinnie the Barber that you have something that they can believe. So these are the issues of using research and practice in real life. So that's some of the advocacy issues. That's closer to the kind of stuff that comes up in the research. But what I realized in thinking about this a little bit more is district leaders and principals spend a lot of time doing professional development and training, and that's also a form of persuasion. You want to start a new program. Part of it is teaching teachers how to do it. Part of it is convincing them that it's worth doing, and it all kind of goes on at once. So all of these things kind of merge. How's it done? Partly through things like hands-on projects. And I think the strength of these programs is the hands-on projects, and I've talked about what some of those are. When I started thinking about this was, what are the conceptual underpinnings that as a doctoral program, we ought to be helping people develop some way of thinking about these issues? And it turns out there's really not much. And this was one of the concerns I had at the end that I hadn't thought about before. One really interesting faculty member used the concept of conceptual stories. And for those political science geeks, there's an article on, causal stories. There's an article on causal stories by Deborah Stone, I believe. And it starts out with the idea that people have a story of how things work. And he builds this into his methodology courses. He says, professors have causal stories, researchers have causal stories. The people you're trying to persuade have causal stories. You have causal stories. And he, as part of his methods courses, he has people analyze some of the early school choice literature and shows helps people see what the causal stories were that the researchers had and how they designed their studies to support their causal stories. So it looks like very rigorous quantitative research, and it is very rigorous quantitative research, but you could have designed it differently to come out with a different answer. And so they talk about what are the implications of this for reading research in terms of understanding the causal stories of the researchers and understanding your causal stories, because there's a tendency to believe what fits with your causal stories and a tendency to discount what doesn't fit with your causal stories, which gets to be an issue for me when I look at the New York Times in the morning. And then they talk about the implications for when you go back to work and you have to deal with the school board, either because you're trying to persuade them or because somebody's coming in with a cockamamie idea that you need to convince people it's not a good idea. And how do you go about doing that? So it turned out to be a very useful idea. And it showed up in 2 courses because he had these students at 2 points in the program. But to my knowledge, it's not something that's a very common way to look at these issues at all, and struck me as very useful given that a lot of these people who are going to be in leadership, and particularly the political side of leadership stuff, they're going to run into it a lot. And it seems like it's something that's worthy of more attention in more programs. The other issue is what Ken Leachwood and Karen Leach at my arm in the middle of all of this would call building a culture of use, which is a school-wide thing. And one of the issues that I began to think about more and more as we got into this is the idea that if we train these people to do research, but you're a leader and you're not really going to be doing that much research. You're going to be too busy holding the ship together and steering it into port and that kind of thing. So if leaders are going to ensure that research is used or any kind of evidence is used in their schools or districts or whatever, they have to do it by setting a culture so other people do it. And they do that in 2 ways, according to the literature, and if you think about it. One is by setting expectations, that if you come into the principal and say, I want to do X, you ought to have some research support for that idea. And the other is through creating the kinds of conditions, the kinds of, by training people, by providing time, by providing adequate facilities for people to do this kind of stuff. So how does that happen? Well, first of all, it's rare. Second of all, if you look at, and I have done this more since I left the GSE than before, the literature on the scholarly practitioner that has been about EDD programs, that literature has been more about creating research-savvy leaders than about creating savvy research users and supporters of research users. So it's more on the how to do than it is on the how to get used kind of side of things. Third of all, it's rarely, all of these programs have various kinds of leadership and organization theory courses. Yay, I taught them. And for the most part, they will talk about building school cultures, but they rarely link that to the issue of using research and evidence. That's one of the things that you might build a culture about. And so we rarely saw any coursework related to this, with, again, one exception at a different, the one hands-on opportunity for doing this, to some extent, I think, is the group dissertations. Where, again, this process of learning to work with others is something you can take back to your place of work when you get done. So I think it's, and there are other implicit things like that. There was another program where the group dissertation would have to go back to the district they studied and share their results at the end, and they would get some coaching from a former superintendent on how to do that so that people would be listening to the presentation at the end. But again, it wasn't a whole lot of either explicit or conceptually grounded instruction, which it seemed to me ought to be part of the story, with one exception, and that is there's a course called Collaborative Approaches to Decision Making. And now I'm going to go find, and it uses books, in case you know about these or want to know about them, with titles like Data Wise, which is a really interesting book about getting a school community to use data to analyze itself, and goes into both the kind of data analysis steps and the group team building to use data steps that you need to look at, or leading professional learning communities. And it had as much attention to working in teams as it is to collecting, analyzing, and then using data as anything else. But again, this was kind of the exception to the rule. It was something that struck me as a model that others could follow. But I don't think it really covered the waterfront of what might be done in this area. So, in conclusion, since the mid-2000s, when the most recent reforms in the EDD started, my take is, at least in the programs we saw, we've seen good progress in making teaching about research more relevant to leaders. It's now more grounded in leaders' lives. You're still not going to get people coming out of an EDD program who are going to do advanced EdStat measurement or something like that, but that's not what they should be doing. And the next area to work on is how to help leaders get research used after they graduate. And that's all, folks. So, Robin's going to, no. Questions? Yeah, Robbie?
So I have two questions that are entirely related. One is around the data use. And what you saw is the expectation, or what the culture said, trying to do, that people go and read research literature and then come in. You said walking to the principal, you better have some research to back it up. Is the expectation that they read this stuff, synthesizes, and then say this is what I want to do because this is what the research says? Or is it a culture in the school in which people collect data in their own classrooms or whatever in order to analyze that, and that's the evidence that's used to justify a particular pedagogical shift or strategy? Or
Okay.
is it both? Those are different things.
Yeah, they are different things. And I'm trying to, I think there's two different, if you get out of the EDD program and you get out of the real world of schools and you look at the literature base, there's two different streams there. And then if you look at what goes on in an EDD program, students spend a lot of time reading literature and learning how to read literature. But what the intent of that is, besides writing a dissertation that looks like a PhD dissertation, is not entirely clear. So the idea of people taking research back to their schools and using that to persuade or something like that is not real explicit in a lot of these programs. The dominant idea is you should learn to collect data and analyze data to answer questions about your school. But just a little snippet from the interviews I've done on the alumni part, from what I've seen of what the alumni do, they're not doing a lot of research, but they have gotten into the habit of looking things up and finding research when they have a problem and using that as one of the things they do to figure out, well, what do we do next? Now, what they use depends on a whole variety of things, and how they find it depends on a whole variety of things. And hopefully we'll have better answers to that when we look at the alumni data. So I would say, no, the using research part, taking that all the way to being a research consumer in the field is less explicit than I had thought it would be when I started the project. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Lisa.
just want to add to that and also have a question. I mean, it seems like there's really three options. One is, and maybe this is, I'm coming from a teacher leadership perspective. One is I'm having a problem. I'm going to go to the research to help me solve that problem. Another is I'm going to go to the research to make a case for X, Y, or Z. And the third is I'm going to collect data and I have the skills to make sense of that data to make some decisions. And I guess there's actually even a fourth one for leaders, which is, and you kind of referred to this, but in the organizational literature, isn't there this idea of creating a learning organization?
That was the last thing I was talking about. When I said building a culture, it's related to that, but I was focusing. Actually, if you think about it, the way you just said it, it's kind of nice. It's like, I'm going to find literature, I'm going to collect data, and then what the other, to solve a problem or to persuade, to act on it. Yeah. And the two,
problem or to persuade.
and then when they merge is when, and this was interesting looking at dissertations, when they merge is when the solution to my problem requires getting somebody else to do something. So it gets a little confounded.
I guess there could be a fifth one there, which is to understand the problem better.
Yeah, and that's, I think, you see a lot of that. That's a lot of why people look at the literature. And although it also happens with data, so.
So my question is, you looked at programs that were strictly leadership development or leadership programs. Is that correct? As
Well,
opposed to
one more bit of data. Of the programs we looked at, 3 of them had no concentrations. So they were called leadership programs. One of them was very explicit about preparing people to take the state superintendency certification program. One of them was leaning towards preparing district leaders. One of them was preparing school and district leaders. And one of them called itself a leadership program and had a K-12 leadership stream, a special ed stream, a curriculum and instruction or curriculum and learning type stream, and a fourth one, higher ed. So the kind of program that we have with multiple concentrations was only 1/4 of our sample.
Well, that was going to be my question is, do you think that your findings shift when you look at a more cross-disciplinary, less K-12 school leader focus? I mean, it sounds like you had one program. Was it an outlier at all in terms of how they thought about these issues? Because it seemed like a lot of your points really had to do, would be most relevant for school and district leaders.
Well, school and district and and higher ed administrator leaders.
I mean, I think that program had some teachers in the program, and they were more, their problems of practice were more focused on stuff in the classroom.
That's what I'm wondering. How does this change for teacher leaders and also for non-formal educational settings? So like here we have a lot of people, higher ed staff who are not necessarily.
Well, the meaning
Higher
of
ed
leader, the meaning, when you get outside of the certification-oriented programs, the meaning of leader can get very
Right.
inclusive. And I think the hope is, in a lot of these programs, that these people take on some kind of leadership role. The program that had the multiple concentrations, I know the person from that program who won the dissertation award went on, and I think this was not typical, but not unusual either, went on to work in a public health or medical school context where her job, her dissertation was about developing some kind of program or curriculum, and her job after that was getting that used throughout the state in question. And I think that required a certain level of leadership as the part of that work.
I mean,
So-
and here too, even with our concentrations, we think of this as leadership
Yeah, teacher
writ
leadership.
large. But my question really had to do with, do you think that that your findings are more specific and would shift if you had a broader array of conceptions of leadership in your sample? And I'm thinking particularly here, where most of our students are not traditional school leaders. Do you think the answers look a little bit different?
I think we would have to do the next study.
Okay.
It's hard to say. I think the issues we're raising, with the possible exception of taking responsibility for building a culture of leadership. I mean, my hope is a lot of these people will be doing work. My personal hope is a lot of these people will be doing work that leads them to want to be persuasive agents in their schools for something.
Well, I'm asking about non-school settings though, really,
Well,
in their organization.
in their organization, yeah. Whether it's, whatever it is that, and I think it could be, and I think a few people are like this. I actually interviewed some people who were teachers in the small number of interviews I did already. But what was interesting to me is while they were in the EDD program or afterwards, even if they kept their teaching position, they would be high school teachers, and like half their time was moved to something with leadership, curriculum development or teacher preparation or training kinds of issues. So they would wind up taking on that kind of responsibility. So these issues would turn out to be relevant for them. And I would think that would happen for a fair number of graduates in a variety of programs, whether it be school-oriented or anything. Drew.
Yeah, so one of the findings in all this whole body of research is the importance of brokers and intermediaries, right? agents somehow that take the research and communicate with the institutions and help them move. And part of what you're saying is these leaders are acting in that kind of
Yes.
role, right?
Explicit, yes.
But I also wonder if there's not a place to actually help develop people as leaders to manage that brokerage process, where they're not the actual brokers, but they're the ones. Because when I think of certain institutions, districts, other policy bodies, that they bring in these various intermediaries and utilize them in more or less effective kinds of ways, right? And is there a role to think about actually helping these future leaders to figure out how to engage others who can provide those services within the institution?
Well, what I'm saying is those people who bring them in, they're brokers. You know, they're internal
Right.
brokers, right? They're the ones in a district who are outward facing to the extent that anyone is. And they're the ones, if you're like a curriculum coordinator or director of curriculum or something like that, you're the one who's going to be scanning the environment. And if somebody says, well, we need a new curriculum for X, Y, and Z, you're the one who's going to go out there and have to decide who are we going to bring in. So I guess my moral argument, if you will, is you ought to be research savvy enough to be able to pick well, and then you ought to have the use skills afterwards to ensure that whatever you move this school or district or institution of higher education or medical school or whatever it is towards using it well.
Right, and how to use it, right?
Right, and how to use it, how to do all of those things. So the idea is think of this as brokerage preparation, if you will.
Right, because there's an interesting study that showed that organizations that were pretty well developed, when they the broker actually depressed results as opposed to coming into an organization where things were pretty impoverished. So for well-functioning organizations in terms of research use, there's particular kinds of roles that you can bring in as opposed to just turning over.
Right.
And you think about professional development, when you just turn over professional development and you're not engaged with it in a school district setting, that stuff never works, right? And it's that same sort of thing.
Well, there is a concept of absorptive capacity that talks about the districts, and it's being applied right now to districts. I think this is what you're talking about. And it talks about the district's ability to, and you could apply it to higher ed, I don't know about other institutions, talks about their ability to bring in ideas and research and other kinds of ideas. And I didn't realize that they talked about internal brokers as depressing that, but it seems to me.
External brokers.
External brokers.
Right, you bring in external intermediate, brokers.
Oh, and you turn it over to them.
Essentially, yeah.
And I guess the argument that is behind the findings is if you have smarter internal brokers, and this is the work that Meredith Honig is doing at the University of Washington, if you have smarter internal brokers, they will know how to manage that process so that doesn't happen. And that should be part of the absorptive capacity.
Yeah. This is from Jennifer Jones.
Hi, Jennifer.
She's asking, as an executive board member, what are ways the GSE AA could support or contribute to your alumni data collection and research?
Oh, well, it would be wonderful. The GSE is not part of the current study. It seemed a little close and personal to study the GSE, so I went somewhere else. But thank you, Jennifer. If people want to borrow the instruments, we can talk about that, but that's for another day. Other questions?
So I'm very intrigued by the group dissertation, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more on, is somewhat on the process, but really on the product. So are they each writing their own, are they divvying up the work and each writing their own thing, or is there one actual dissertation that comes out, and how does that get defended then?
Okay, so let me get a little bit outside of our project first and put this in a little context. The group dissertation, at least in the CPED context where I can get some data from a friend, is an unusual option. It's not real common in EDD land. I'm aware of 3 places, 2 that we're studying and 1 that we tried to get into and failed, that use different models, okay? One model is the client model, where a group of students is assigned a client district or whatever. In this case, it's districts. And I think this is the Vanderbilt model, and I think this is Virginia Commonwealth too. And the client comes in with a problem, and the group has to solve it in a year, or collect data and analyze. Solve might be too strong, but come up with a report that moves the ball forward somehow. The 2 that we studied, one of them, let's see, one of them, there would be, typically there would be a district. They differed in whether the groups were formed at the end of the first year or at the end of the second year. In both cases, the students would have a set of, each student would have done some literature reviewing, because I guess it's pretty minimal at the end of the first year, a little more advanced if you do it at the end of the second year. They would do some literature reviewing. They would come to, the faculty would usually put them together, although in the 2-year program, students would have an opportunity. I guess in the 1-year program, the faculty would put them together. In the 2-year program, tell me if I get this wrong, program, the students would have a window in the middle of the second year to form groups. And it was sort of like at middle school lunch, who's sitting with who, and struck us as not necessarily the most effective way to do this. So you would have some people who knew this was coming and they put their groups together and they'd be ready to go. And then you'd have the ones at the end who's, I didn't know this was going to happen. And they'd be kind of the leftovers. And then they would have to write a proposal together. And the person who did the coaching on the proposal writing process, there would be a course for this, called a literature review course on how to write a literature review, but it was really how to write your group literature review. She would say, you can pay now or you can pay later. You as an individual student can stick with your problem that you're interested in right up to the end. And then you can have like 3 to 5 really well-developed programs that you've got to smash into one proposal. Or you can start working together right at the beginning and come up with something you're all interested in. And it seemed to work out in different ways with different groups, and most groups, pulled it together at the end. The other group, started earlier, and so they didn't have quite so much of the investment in a particular problem issue. But they would have a district they were going to study, but with an idea that it was going to be about some topic of general interest to them. One program had a unified product, and one program thought it was going to have a unified product when it started. And then the central administration stepped in and said, that doesn't seem very responsible. So there is a, quote, unified product with 5 data analysis sections, 1 or 3, however many students there are, 1 for each student. So there's like sections for each student. And there's an issue of how this gets put into the data repository thing. So there's different ways to run it, and there's different ways to sell it to a central administration. And I think I'm getting the ball here. So.
No, we got one more.
Oh, one more question.
So
Yeah.
finish with you.
Okay, so that's, yeah, and that's, but yeah, it winds up with one thing between 2 covers, but how much of it can be attributed to one student? And what happens with it afterwards is a question we're kind of sorting through right now, because where there were their district studies, they seem to go in and say, well, here's what we found. And it's not a client-based thing, so people can take it or leave it. With the other one, it's very interesting. There's a whole variety. Some people develop products and try to get them used afterwards. One project I know about, they wound up somehow hooking up with a lobbying organization for the state and were collecting data to lobby for something. They helped them lobby for something the group thought was very important, and some things seemed to die on the shelf, but the faculty clearly want the dissertations to get used somehow or other. So that's that. Last question? Or?
Margaret Hayes.
Oh, wow. Hi, Margaret.
She's on video if you want to see her. Certain school settings are more open and some are less open. How did the EDD candidates in the studies get buy-in for doing their studies?
Okay, it depends again on the type. Typically, if it's an individual dissertation, the student negotiates it at the place of work and knows that the student can do it, or find someplace else to go. With the group dissertations, where it was a district study, it was really interesting. This program, we didn't go into this, but this program had very active support from clinical faculty who were former superintendents, most of whom had graduated from the program at one point, who were super networked throughout the state and the region around the program. And they would help negotiate access to a district, which may have been why they were very interested in the coaching, to make sure people were happy at the end. And then in the other group dissertation project, where the nature of the project varied substantially. Sometimes it was a design-based project, sometimes it was a photo particular base. It would depend on the nature of the project, but the students were pretty much on their own. But it wasn't always in a school or in a district, so it would vary.
Okay, thank you, Bill. This was great.
Thank you all.
Good to have you. Thanks so much.
Right.
I can
I don't want
unmute
to,
her.
not bite yet. Is she still on? Yeah, I can talk to Margaret. Yes.
Yeah. Margaret, you're unmuted if you want to.
Hi, Bill. How are you?
Fine. How are you?
I'm great. This was a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, good to hear from you. Where are you these days?
I am about to retire from Scotch Plains Famwood.
Oh, wow.
I'm going to be retiring end of July.